The sky burned red as the ship tore apart above the barren world. Fire streaked across the horizon, scattering debris like falling stars. Inside the last pod, a figure lay still, her pale hands clutching the cold seat as the craft screamed down through the thin atmosphere. She had once walked in palaces of crystal light, her voice carrying the command of an empire. Now she was nothing but a prisoner of fate, cast out and forgotten. Princess Arya had never believed her brother would go so far. He had spoken the words. With that calm smile of his, the one she had trusted since childhood. You are no longer of the blood. The council finds you guilty. Exile. There had been no chance to speak, no one to defend her. Soldiers had dragged her through the grand halls, the banners of her family hanging above, until she was forced into the pod and hurled toward this desolate place. She knew the truth. It had not been the council's decision, it was his. He wanted the throne, and she was in his way. When the pod struck the ground, the world went black. Hours later, she awoke to the sting of smoke in her lungs and the ache of bruises across her body. The pod was cracked open like an egg, its systems dead. Her dress of woven silk, once glowing with imperial thread, was now torn and stained with dust. She staggered out into the wasteland, clutching her side where blood seeped between her fingers. Around her stretched an endless desert of jagged stone and pale sand, the wind carrying a hollow, empty sound. There was no water, no shelter, no hope. Her people had meant for her to die here. It was a place chosen with care, far beyond the roots of trade, barren and silent. The Empire's record would show her as gone, and her brother's rule would be secure. She tried to stand tall, tried to summon the pride of her house, but her knees shook and she fell to the ground. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of death pressing close. But fate is not always blind. Far away, moving slowly across the cracked earth, came a lone human. Daniel was no knight, no soldier of renown. He was an explorer, a wanderer, who charted forgotten places at the edge of mapped space. His ship had landed on the far side of the desert weeks ago, seeking mineral samples. He had expected nothing but long, dull days of study. Yet when the sky had burned with the fire of falling metal, he had gone to see. He thought he might find wreckage worth salvaging, maybe scraps of tech to sell. What he found instead was a woman lying broken in the dust. He hurried to her side, kneeling in the sand. Her skin was pale, marked by strange symbols along her neck. Her eyes bright with a faint glow that spoke of her alien blood. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. She tried to push him away weakly, whispering words in her own tongue, but her strength failed her. Daniel was no scholar of alien politics. He had no idea who she was. All he saw was a dying woman, and he could not walk away. He lifted her gently, carrying her with effort across the rocks toward the small shelter he had built near the cliffs. His muscles burned, and the heat bit at his skin, but he refused to stop. He laid her on his bedroll, fetched water, and cleaned her wounds with steady hands. She fought him at first, her pride refusing to accept help, but her body betrayed her. Fever came, and with it restless dreams. Daniel stayed at her side through the night, feeding the fire, cooling her brow, speaking to her even though she could not hear. When morning broke, she opened her eyes and saw him sitting by the fire. His face worn but calm. His clothes were simple, patched with rough stitches. His hands were calloused, his hair unkempt, yet there was a quiet strength in the way he sat guard. She remembered her brother's voice, cold and merciless, and she looked at this stranger who had chosen, without reason, to save her. "Why?" she whispered, her voice rough with thirst. "Why would you do this?" Daniel turned, surprised, to hear her speak. He offered her the cup of water he had boiled. "Because you needed help. No one deserves to be left out here alone." She stared at him as if he had spoken nonsense. Among her people, Humans were little more than a subject of amusement, a young race that stumbled through space with crude ships and clumsy tools. They were tolerated, never respected. And yet here was one, risking himself to keep her alive. When her own blood had cast her aside, "I did not ask for your aid," she said, her tone sharp despite her weakness. He smiled faintly. "I know, but I gave it anyway." For a long time, silence hung between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the desert wind. She wanted to push him away, to cling to the pride that was all she had left, yet the warmth of the water in her hands and the steadiness of his gaze unsettled her. He was no soldier, no prince, no one of rank or name. He was simply human. And for reasons she could not yet understand, he had chosen to save her when the universe had decreed her death. As night fell again, Arya lay staring at the stars beyond the cliff, her body still weak but her mind restless. She could not understand this man, and she did not trust him. But deep inside, a thought began to form, a thought she dared not voice. Perhaps her exile was not the end. Perhaps fate had placed this human in her path for a reason. Daniel added another branch to the fire, the flames casting light across his face. He glanced at her and gave a small nod, as if to say she was safe. She turned away, unwilling to admit the comfort it brought. Yet even as sleep claimed her, one truth burned in her heart. Her people had left her to die. Only a human dared to save her, and that was something she could not forget. The days that followed were harsh. The desert gave no mercy, and the sun burned with a heat that stripped the strength from bone and spirit alike. Daniel moved with quiet purpose, gathering what little the land would give. He carried water from a trickle that seeped between the rocks of the cliff, boiled it in a battered pot, and shared it with the woman who lay recovering. He hunted small lizards with crude traps, roasted them over the fire, and divided the meat, though it was never enough for two. Arya watched him with silent eyes, still proud, still unwilling to thank him. Yet every breath she drew was because of his labor. At first she spoke little. Her voice carried the weight of command even in weakness, and she demanded to know who he was and why he had brought her here. He answered simply that his name was Daniel, that he was a human explorer, and that he had no reason other than decency to help her. She found this answer absurd, almost insulting. No being in her empire would act without a motive. No one would give without expectation. She tried to believe he must want something, her knowledge, her status, perhaps even her body, but his eyes carried no hunger, only a steady kindness that unsettled her more than greed ever could. One evening, when the wind howled against the cliffs and the stars were hidden behind dust, she asked him why he was alone in such a place. He stirred the fire and said he liked to see the edges of things, the forgotten worlds where no empire reached. He said he liked silence, and he liked the work of survival because it showed him who he was. She found his words strange. In her world, survival was assumed, guaranteed by fleets and wealth. No one chose hardship. Yet here was this man, living in it by choice, and somehow standing strong. As her wounds healed, she tried to walk again. Her legs trembled, and she stumbled across the rocky ground, cursing in her own tongue. Daniel caught her before she fell and told her to move slower. She pulled away from him, anger flashing in her eyes, for she hated feeling weak before a human. Yet when she sat by the fire later, breath ragged, she could not ignore the truth that without his hands she would have struck her head on stone. The thought sat heavy on her heart. In the days that passed, she began to see the details of him. His hands were scarred from years of work, his back strong though bent with labor. He mended torn fabric with crook stitches, yet he did it with patience. When the fire grew low at night, he rose to feed it even in half-sleep. She realized he had carried her more than once, shifting her position when fever left her restless. He never spoke of it, never sought praise, and this too confused her. Among her people every act was measured, weighed for advantage. Here, this man acted as if the only measure was whether it needed to be done. But pride dies slowly. She began to argue with him over small things. When he cut strips of meat too thin, she told him it was wasteful. When he rationed the water, she called him cowardly. Daniel only listened, his mouth turning in a tired smile. And then he did what he thought best. It drove her mad that he did not bend to her, that he did not treat her as royalty. She was a princess even if cast down, yet he seemed to see her as no more than another person in need. She told herself she hated him for it, though deep within a part of her wondered if this was what freedom felt like. The desert was not empty of life. At night strange shapes moved on the horizon, tall creatures with many legs that prowled the dunes. One evening, as the fire flickered low, a pair of glowing eyes appeared at the edge of the camp. Daniel grabbed the sharpened pole he used as a spear and stood before her, though the beast was twice his height. His hands shook, but he did not run. The creature lunged, and for a breath Arya saw his death in its shadow. She reached for the broken fragment of her royal device, the last piece of her pod's tech. It sparked weakly in her hand, but with one desperate thrust she fired a beam that scorched the creature's hide and drove it back into the dark. When silence returned, Daniel turned to her, sweat shining on his brow. He thanked her with a nod, and she looked away quickly, hiding the tremor in her chest. She had acted not for him, she told herself, but for survival. Yet in truth, for the first time, she had felt the fear of losing him. The following morning she sat by the fire while Daniel worked on repairing the water pouch. She stared at the fragment of her device, its power nearly gone. She thought of her brother, of the empire that had cast her out, of the way they had expected her to die nameless in the sand. She thought too of the human sitting before her, who knew nothing of her lineage, nothing of her title, yet gave her more protection than her own blood had offered. She asked him then why he had not abandoned her when she fought him at every turn. He looked up, frowning as if the question itself was strange. He said simply that leaving her behind would not have been right. She pressed him, asking what he gained from this, and he shrugged as if the answer was too plain to require thought. He said sometimes people help because they must, not because they seek reward. His words lingered with her long after, stirring something she did not want to name. She was raised to believe humans were small, weak, unworthy of respect. Yet this man was stronger than any noble she had known, not in power but in spirit. That night she could not sleep. The stars shone above the cliffs, endless and sharp, and the desert wind carried whispers she could almost mistake for voices of her ancestors. She remembered the oath of her house, the promise to guard the people, the duty of the crown. She had believed herself betrayed and broken, but now a thought burned inside her like a coal. Perhaps her exile was not the end, but the beginning of something far greater. Perhaps her fate was to learn from the one race her people had always ignored. As she drifted into restless dreams, one truth repeated itself in her mind. She had saved the human because she could not bear to see him fall. And if danger came again, she would stand beside him. The days turned into a rhythm, though the desert offered little peace. Each morning Daniel rose before the sun lifted above the horizon and set out with his crude tools, returning with whatever food he could catch or roots he could find. Arya grew stronger with each passing day, her wounds closing, her body regaining some of its grace, though her pride still sat between them like a wall. Yet the wall had cracks now, for she could not deny that his care had kept her alive, and the long hours beside the fire forced her to see him not as a primitive creature, but as a man with thoughts, fears, and a strange strength that did not come from weapons or wealth. Sometimes she caught him staring at the horizon, lost in thought, and she wondered what weight he carried in silence. One evening, when the desert sky was painted in bands of gold and violet, she asked him if he missed his people. He answered slowly, saying he had left no family behind, that he had chosen this life because he wanted to see what lay beyond the maps. He admitted there were times he longed for voices other than his own, and she realized then how lonely his journey had been. She thought of her own palace, always full of advisors and courtiers, yet none of them had ever truly listened to her heart. In her exile, she found more truth in the words of this solitary human than she had in years of council halls. Their uneasy alliance grew into something more practical. Daniel showed her how to set snares from scraps of wire and bone, how to weave reeds into baskets to carry water, how to mark stones so they would not lose their way in the shifting sands. She had never lowered herself to such tasks in her life, but now she found herself watching closely, learning each detail, and to her surprise, she took pride when her hand succeeded. In return, she shared what she remembered from her education, teaching him about the stars above, the hidden patterns of navigation, and the properties of plants they might find. He listened with the curiosity of a child, and she felt a strange warmth that someone valued her words not because of her title, but because they came from her. Still, shadows lay heavy on her heart. She could not hide from him forever the reason. She had been cast into this place. One night, as the fire burned low and the wind carried a mournful whistle through the cliffs, she told him. She spoke of her brother, the younger prince who had long envied her position as heir. She told him how he had whispered lies to the council, claiming she conspired with enemies, claiming she plotted against the empire itself. The council had believed him, or perhaps they had feared him more than they trusted her. Without trial, without defense, she had been stripped of name and power and sent to die. Her voice cracked as she spoke, though she tried to keep it steady. She had carried herself with strength through pain and hunger, but here by the fire her shoulders bent under the weight of betrayal. Daniel listened without interruption, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finished, silence lingered, and she feared he might see her as a fallen ruler unworthy of respect. Instead, he shook his head slowly and said no family should do such a thing. No brother should cast aside his own blood. His words were simple, yet they cut through her sorrow with unexpected comfort. She asked him then what a human would do if betrayed by kin. He thought for a long time before answering. He said some men might surrender, some might seek revenge, but he believed the better path was to stand and prove themselves stronger, to live in such a way that no lie could destroy them. She turned those words over in her mind, realizing they were not the words of a warrior or politician, but of someone who understood hardship in a different way. Perhaps that was why they struck so deep. For a time it seemed they might carve out a fragile existence together, but the universe does not let secrets rest. On the third week after her exile, while they searched for dry wood near the cliffs, a strange sound filled the air. It was a high-pitched hum, mechanical and cold. Arya froze, her heart pounding, for she knew the sound well. Through the rising dust she saw it, an imperial probe, its metallic shell gleaming faintly in the sun as it scanned the ground with a red beam. Her breath caught in her throat. It had found the wreck of her pod. Soon it would confirm her death or, worse, discover she still lived. Daniel sensed her fear and asked what it was. She told him in a voice low and tight that it was a messenger, a tool of the Empire, and if it marked her alive, then assassins would surely follow. He frowned and reached for his spear, though it was a laughable weapon against such a machine. She raised her fragment of broken tech, aimed, and fired a weak burst that struck the probe and sent it crashing into the sand. Smoke rose from its shell, but she knew it was too late. Even in its last moment, it had likely sent a signal, a beacon across the stars. Her brother would know she still breathed. For a long while they stood in silence, the ruined machine at their feet. Daniel turned to her, his jaw set, and said if enemies came, they would face them together. She tried to protest, saying he had no reason to risk his life for her quarrels. But he shook his head with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through every day in the desert. He said he would not abandon her now, not after all they had endured. That night Arya sat apart from the fire, staring at the endless sky. Fear gnawed at her, not of death, but of what his death might mean. She had told herself again and again that he was only human, fragile, and unimportant, yet she knew the truth now. She needed him, not only to survive the desert, but because he had shown her what true loyalty meant. If assassins came, she would fight with every last spark of her strength, not for her throne, not for vengeance, but for the human who had dared to save her when no one else would. The desert wind carried the scent of smoke from the fire, and she clenched her fists as a vow formed in her heart. Her exile had begun in despair, but now she would not meet death as a broken princess. She would stand with Daniel, whatever storm her brother sent to this forsaken world. The desert was never truly silent again after the probe. For days, Arya felt the weight of unseen eyes, the sense that every gust of wind carried the promise of death. Daniel noticed her restlessness, the way she would rise in the night and stare at the stars, her hand always near the fragment of her broken device. He said little, but he too began to prepare. His hand shaped new weapons from bone and stone, sharpened poles into spears, and dug shallow pits that could serve as traps. None of it would stand long against the Empire's soldiers, yet he worked. With a stubbornness that made her chest ache, she asked him once why he bothered, why he did not take his ship and leave before danger arrived. He looked at her as if the question was strange, then answered in his quiet way that he had found something worth standing for. She could not reply. Her pride told her she was still a princess, that she deserved loyalty, but she knew deep down his words were not about her crown. They were about her as a person, about the bond they had formed in fire and hardship. It frightened her and warmed her all at once. When the assassins came, they came at dawn. The sky split with the thunder of descending craft, small but deadly, carrying soldiers dressed in armor that shimmered like black glass. Arya felt her heart race as she recognized the markings of the royal guard. These were not common hunters. These were the Empire's finest killers, sent to erase her from existence. Dust swirled as their ship landed on the flat stone. Near the cliffs, Daniel gripped his spear tighter, his jaw set, his body tense. Arya turned to him and told him to run, her voice fierce. She said this fight was hers alone, that he had no place dying for her quarrel. But Daniel only shook his head, his eyes steady. He told her he had made his choice long ago when he carried her from the wreck. He said he would not abandon her now. She wanted to shout, to command him as she once commanded legions, but the words died in her throat when she saw the quiet fire in his eyes. He was human, yet he was stronger than any warrior she had ever known. The assassins advanced in a line, their weapons humming with deadly energy. Daniel moved quickly, leading Arya behind the rocks where he had set his traps. The first soldier stepped onto the sand and fell into a pit, the sharp stakes piercing his armor. Another lunged forward, only to be struck by a heavy stone Daniel had rigged to swing from above. For a moment, Arya stared in awe, realizing that his crude tools, born of survival, were claiming victories against warriors her empire feared. But the numbers were against them. Blades of light cut through stone, and the air filled with the hiss of weapons. Daniel fought with his spear, moving with raw determination, striking and retreating, always placing himself between Arya and danger. She fired the last bursts of her device, its power dwindling, each shot taking down one more enemy. Together they moved as one, his grit and her fading technology holding back a storm of steel. Yet even the strongest will can break before endless force. A soldier struck Daniel across the chest with a burning blade, and he fell hard to the ground, his spear shattered. Arya screamed and rushed to his side, firing wildly until the last spark of her weapon died. She knelt beside him, pressing her hands to the wound, her heart pounding in terror. Daniel gasped, his eyes unfocused, yet his hand found hers and held it tight. He whispered that she had to stand, that she could not give in, not now. Rage. Sorrow burned inside her. For so long she had believed herself abandoned, unworthy, yet here was a man who had given everything to keep her alive. She rose, her voice carrying across the battlefield with the strength of a true heir. She called out to the soldiers, declaring that their loyalty had been twisted, that the true traitor was the brother who sent them. Her words rang with such power that even the assassins hesitated, their steps faltering as they heard the fire in her voice. In that moment, she realized she was no longer speaking as a princess of blood, but as someone reborn in exile. She fought, not for a throne, but for the human who had shown her the meaning of loyalty. She picked up Daniel's broken spear and stood tall, her body trembling but her spirit unyielding. The soldiers circled, uncertain, their discipline clashing with doubt. Suddenly the air filled with the sound of engines. From the sky descended another ship, larger, its hull marked not with the royal crest, but with the symbols of independent clans. The assassins turned in alarm, for reinforcements had not been expected. The ship landed with a roar, and figures emerged, rebels who had long opposed the Empire's cruelty. They had intercepted the probe signal and come to see the truth for themselves. Chaos followed. The assassins found themselves caught between Arya's defiance and the sudden strike of the rebels. Arya knelt quickly beside Daniel, whispering that he must hold on. His eyes fluttered, but he smiled faintly and told her not to waste tears. She gripped his hand and swore she would not let him go, not when he had carried her through fire and despair. The battle raged, and the desert shook with the clash of steel and flame. By the time the dust settled, the assassins lay defeated, their ship burning on the flat stone. Arya remained kneeling beside Daniel, her gown torn and blood-stained, her hand still pressed to his wound. She had never felt fear like this, the fear of losing not power, not status, but someone who mattered more than all the stars in her empire. She whispered to him that he had given her more than life, that he had shown her what her people had forgotten. She begged him to stay, to fight with her one more time. His breath was weak, but his eyes opened, and in them she saw the same steady fire that had never left him. For the first time since exile, she bowed her head, not as a princess but as a woman who owed her life and her heart to a human. She promised him that if he lived, she would never again allow her people to call his kind lesser. She would make the Empire see what she had seen in him, what she could never forget. The sun rose over the desert, painting the sky in red and gold. The battle was over, but the war for truth had only begun. The desert lay quiet after the battle. Smoke curled from the wreck of the assassin ship, black against the pale sky. Arya sat on the ground with Daniel's head resting in her lap, her hand still pressed to the wound across his chest. She whispered to him again and again, urging him to stay, her voice trembling though she tried to sound strong. His breath came shallow, each rise of his chest a victory against the silence that tried to claim him. The rebels who had landed moved about the battlefield, gathering weapons and speaking in hushed voices. Some of them looked at Arya with awe, others with suspicion, but none dared disturb the scene before them. One of the rebels, a tall man with dark eyes, came forward and knelt beside her. He told her they had listened to her voice as she stood against the assassins, that they had heard the truth in her words. They had long hated the Empire's cruelty, but seeing a princess abandoned by her own kin stirred something deeper. Arya looked at him with weary eyes and told him she cared nothing for crowns anymore. She said all that mattered was that the truth be known, that the Empire see what loyalty and courage truly meant. She turned her gaze down at Daniel as she said this, and the rebel leader understood. They carried Daniel aboard the rebel ship, laying him on a bed of rough blankets. Arya sat beside him through the long journey away from the desert world, refusing to leave his side even for food or sleep. She spoke to him softly in the dark, telling him stories of her childhood, of the gardens she had once walked, of the stars she had memorized as a girl. She told him he had given her back something she thought lost, not her title, but her sense of worth beyond it. Sometimes his eyes fluttered open, and he would smile faintly, whispering that she should rest. But she never did. The rebels gave her access to their transmitter, a device patched together from stolen parts. She stood before it and sent a message across the stars. Her voice carried on waves of light to every corner of the Empire. She spoke of betrayal, of the lies her brother had told, of the sentence of exile meant to erase her. She revealed the truth not with bitterness but with fire. She declared that she had been left to die, and that her survival came not from fleets or wealth or the power of the throne, but from a single human who had stood against an empire's wrath. Her words traveled far, reaching ears that had never before cared for humans. She described Daniel's courage, his refusal to abandon her even when death closed in, his strength that came not from weapons but from heart. She told the Empire that such loyalty was greater than any crown, that the human race, so long dismissed, had shown her what nobility truly meant. Her voice shook at times, but her resolve never faltered. She ended by vowing that she would not claim her place again through blood alone, but through the truth of what she had witnessed. The message spread faster than her brother could silence it. Across the Empire whispers rose, then voices, then shouts. Some called her words lies, but others who had long feared the cruelty of the throne found hope in them. To hear a princess speak with such conviction, to place honor upon a race thought small, it was something new, something dangerous to the order her brother had built. On the rebel ship, Arya stayed beside Daniel, watching his wounds slowly knit. With the help of crude medicine, days passed, and though he remained weak, his spirit refused to fade. One evening as the ship drifted between stars, he opened his eyes more fully than before. She leaned close, relief breaking through her composure, and asked him if he understood what had happened. He said he remembered fire, pain, and her voice calling him back. He asked if the assassins were gone, and she told him they were. He asked if she was safe, and she smiled through her tears, saying only because of him. When he tried to speak again, she pressed her hand to his lips and told him to rest. She whispered that he had changed her, that whatever path lay ahead, she would walk it, not as the princess she once was, but as someone who carried the strength of a human's defiance. He closed his eyes, and for the first time she believed he would live. Weeks later, the rebels carried her to a hidden station where allies of many species gathered. Word of her broadcast had already reached them. They greeted her not as a princess restored, but as a symbol of resistance, and she accepted it. She no longer cared for the weight of crowns. What she carried was more important, the living proof that humanity was not to be dismissed. She brought Daniel forward when he was strong enough to walk, his body still marked by scars, but his spirit unbroken. The hall fell silent as she told them that this man, this human, had done what no empire's fleet had dared. He had stood against death itself to protect another. The silence broke into voices, then cheers. Among those gathered, respect for humanity began to grow, small at first, but spreading like fire on dry grass. They looked at Daniel not as a lesser being, but as the first of a kind whose courage could not be measured in ships or weapons. Arya stood beside him, her head high, not as royalty, but as one who had been saved by him. She declared that if the Empire wanted to silence her again, they would have to silence the truth of humanity. And that was something no throne could do. Her brother raged across the stars, sending messages filled with threats and promises of war, but already his power trembled. An empire could crush armies, but it could not so easily crush an idea, and the idea had already taken root. The image of a human saving a princess, of a man with nothing defying the weight of a dynasty, burned too brightly to be hidden. In time Daniel healed, and though he sought no glory, he stood at her side as they faced what lay ahead. Arya never forgot the desert, never forgot the smoke and blood and fear, but most of all, she never forgot the choice he had made when he could have walked away. She carried that choice like a banner, and with it, she changed not only herself but the way the galaxy would see humans forever. As they stood together on the station's deck, staring out at the endless stars, Arya spoke softly to him. She said once she had thought exile was the end of her story, but now she knew it was the beginning. He smiled at her words, simple and true, and answered that sometimes beginnings are hidden in the places where we believe all is lost. She slipped her hand into his, no longer ashamed of needing him, no longer bound by the pride that once ruled her. Together they looked into the night, and in that silence the first legend of humanity was born. The end.